So these were the first tiles that I made in my studio, and I was inspired by the rich iconography of the Taj Mahal. So this is inspired by two doors and windows at the Taj Mahal. And as you can see, they are very rich. And it took me about 2 years again. So this was another period in my life that I sat down and I tested glazes like crazy. And so it took me 2 years to develop the design, to carve the design, make the molds, make the different sizes, and develop the glazes that I was going to use with these styles. So this was a glossy brown, and some of these glazes I still use today. So I use glazes that the glaze from Bezalel, the glaze from University of Miami, and the glazes that I used, that I developed in this period. And what I wanted the glazes to do was either to highlight the surface or to blur the surface. So you see in the tile that is on the right, it's a beautiful way in which the glaze, how it breaks into the different details of the surface. And in the one on the left, the glaze is blurring the stars that they have underneath. So the glaze on the right is a barium matte from Balcushing, and in this case has 4 grams of copper to make it blue. And the one on the left is a very glossy, very runny glaze that has cracks beautifully. And in this case, it has rutil, and that's what is creating the crystals. So this is the same tile that I was showing you before. You see the Taj Mahal on the left is again this tile with a glossy glaze that I call SG. The recipe came from a book, and it has a lot of rutil. And so here the same glaze completely blurs the design or highlights the design. So during that period, I was also teaching tile making at the Maryland College of Art and Design, which doesn't exist anymore. But two of my students, called John and Lynn, told me that I should show my work at the Tile Heritage Foundation sale that was taking place at in Western Pennsylvania at the Moravian Tile Pottery. The Moravian Tile Pottery, if you haven't been there, is a trip that I highly recommend. It's a day trip. It was founded by Henry Chapman Mercer in the year 1901. 1901 or 1910, beginning of the century. And this is his house, his castle, and next to his house there is also the factory where he would manufacture tiles. And what is interesting is that the factory still makes the original tiles that he designed with local clay, and the house itself is completely decorated with tiles. There is not 1 inch that is not covered with the tiles. So it's crazy and it's worthwhile visiting. So anyway, back to the art fair. So I did show my tiles at the Moravian Tile Show organized by the Tile Heritage. And it was the first time that I was approached by urban archaeology. Urban Archaeology is a store in New York that has locations also in Chicago. And the owners, Judith Stockman and her husband, started this store selling antique hardware. And then at the time they saw my tiles, that was the time that they wanted to expand, also to include tiles in their collection. So I worked with them all the time that I sold tiles. It was mostly through them, and they had beautiful collection of other tile makers. So it was really nice to be a part of their store, and so it was. I think I was there at the right place at the right time. I just was in Doylestown at the time that Judy Stockman was looking for tile makers, and she saw my work. So this is a page of the website that I had at the time. And you can see this is a swimming pool that was done in Rhode Island in Newport. And you can see on the top, I don't know if you can see well, but there is a turquoise band, and that has the crackle glossy glaze that I told you about. And here you can see how glossy and how much the glaze cracks. And that's, I think, quite beautiful. On the left, there is a band of a metallic tile. So this is the bronze glaze with gold luster on top. And in the bottom, you see the two tiles that were used for this swimming pool. They are both with the Valcushing barium glaze that has 4% of copper and 2% of titanium, and that makes it turquoise instead of blue. When I started making the tiles, a great help was the book of Frank Giorgini. I had an idea of how to make tiles, but this book gave me a great framework for how to follow steps, and he is very specific, and I highly recommend his book if you ever want to make tiles. But the difference with the way Giorgini was making his tiles, you see in the picture in the bottom, you can see that he did the prototype, the original tile, in clay. He would carve a clay tile. And that's not great because you use the tile to make a mold, like in the picture on the left, right? You see a plaster being cast on top of the tile to create a mold. And once you make that mold, you have to throw away the prototype. And you can press clay into that mold and use that mold as your master mold. And then from that, you make many clay tiles that you make your many pressing molds, but the process is very complicated. And you can mess up with the different tiles can have different shrinkage. So I knew I wanted to make my prototypes with rubber. So I'm going to take a detour now of my story, and I'm going to show you how I did the rubber prototypes. So any questions so far, Jan?
There was just one question, which is, what is the clay body you were using for your tiles?
Great question. That was another thing that I was testing when I was in this period of 2 years. I used the porcelain number 213 from Standard Supply. And I use that because it's a very smooth clay. It fires cone 6 and is a nice, it's not exactly a porcelain. It's called porcelain, but it's not. It's a white clay body. But the color response in a white background was very important to me. Using stoneware, it's easier. The tiles deform less, but it's like painting on brown paper. Okay, all right. So I continue. Any more questions so far? All right. Okay, so here you have me doing a block of plaster. So to make the rubber, the best way is to create first a block of plaster that I'm going to carve with the design. So I made here a box, and then, I seal the edges. You see that all the edges are sealed, and the bottom has a soap, so the plaster doesn't stick. And here is how I mix the plaster. I use what is called the island method, which is not very precise. I don't measure the plaster when I do press molds. And so you just put a plaster in the water until you see what is called an island. And then when that island gets completely wet, that's when you start mixing with your hand, because you have to fill the plaster. And after a minute, you pour the plaster into your box. The plaster block is about 1 inch thick. And this is my plaster block after drying. It has to be completely dry for you to be able to transfer a design. On the right, you can see this design that I am about to transfer to this plaster block. And the reason I am doing all of this is because I'm going to do the carving on plaster. When you carve on plaster, you get much more precise design, much precise carving than if you are carving on clay. Probably if you have that experience in clay, it's much harder to get the absolute finest detail that are easy to get when you're carving plaster. So I put the paper face down. So this is a photocopy of a design that I did in Kinko's. The ink from old printers works the best. Sometimes the ink from probably the copier that you have in your house may not work, but you have to know that from Kinko's, the copier from Kinko's has ink that will translate to the plaster. So I put the paper face down and I wrap the back with a lot of acetone, layer and upon layer, and I rub until I'm satisfied with how the design was transferred to the plaster block. And you can see that on the right. And these are some of the tools that I use to carve the surface. You can see on the picture on the left that I began to carve a little bit of the flower. You can use mini chisels or needles or X-Acto knife or whatever tool you find comfortable. The thing with tools is when you will develop your favorite tools as you go, and you'll find your own. So these are the ones that work for me. And on the picture on the right, what you see is after I supposed to finish the carving, I didn't do the carving in this demo, but once the full carving is finished, I made a frame with balsa wood that is about half an inch thick. And I glue, the frame has to be very precise, has to be exactly the measurements that the tile is going to have. You cannot make any mistakes here because you are making the prototype. You don't want to make something that has a mistake. And so I glue the frame to the plaster. You can seal the edges on the outside, and then you have to seal the porous surface of the plaster before you pour rubber on top. So I have here, I have in my studio a universal release agent, but when I was teaching this at the Corcoran, we used to seal the surface with palm oil, which is that's spray oil, cooking oil, and that seals the pores. And here I have the kind of rubber that I pour. So on that frame, I pour a mixture of rubber. And this is the rubber from Smooth On. It's super easy to use. You just mix 2 parts by volume, and I just eyeball the amount. After doing it so many times, I kind of knew how much rubber to use to make the tile. You pour the mixture into your frame and you let it dry for a day, and then you take it out and you make a mold using that rubber. That rubber tile will last you forever, and you can always make tiles.